Welcome to a fantastic edition of Rebellion's educational series. We're here with General John F. Hussey of the U.S. Army to talk about the Iran War. General, thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you for having me. And just for clearance, I'm retired, but all good.
Awesome. Yeah, we love to talk about the Strait of Hormuz. Do you think that Iran can choke it if it wants to?
So it's interesting now because as we get reports out today, it seems that it was the first time since World War II where a torpedo actually sunk an Iranian vessel. The reports coming out of the Middle East right now is that the U.S. and Israel has decimated the Iranian Navy, but they still have a missile capability. They have a drone capability. And you see a lot of times we've even seen in the movie Dunkirk, right, where militias can go out. The Chinese use this as well. So it could be suicidal boats going out there filled with explosives that could still cause damage. And when you have commercial tankers carrying that much fuel, oil through the Straits of Hormuz, it's risky business. There's a chance of death, right? Casualties from these civilian cargo ships coming through, and also environmental disaster. So even though the reporting looks good as far as reducing the risk in the Straits of Hormuz, one still has to be careful because Iran still has capabilities to do damage in that area.
So if you were an oil investor, you would see oil potentially going up for a while now.
That's correct. And there's a matter of insurance, and there's talk, and we did this back in the 80s too, during the Iran-Iraq war, where US naval vessels and you could potentially see other countries too, flag the ships differently and provide escort. But it's just like what we used to call a VBIED in Iraq or Afghanistan, right? A vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, where it's filled with some form of explosive, and it drives into an American or a NATO vehicle and can cause death and destruction. So if you take a speedboat, right, and obviously there would be engineering involved and some form of a chemist doing the analysis of how much would be needed, where to damage, what part of the ship to hit, it could still create damage. And of course, insurance risks and those companies are going to have to make a decision whether it's in their best interest. But regardless, you can see a cost in oil going up. Yes.
See. So you think energy assets in the region in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia will continue to bear down with fire?
Again, yeah, I see it. I think part of the reason that Iran may have struck out at some of those Gulf nations is basically similar to what Saddam did in Desert Storm. He did that into Israel to kind of break the alliance. The thinking may be that if Iran strikes out at some of those Gulf nations, they may put pressure on Washington and Tel Aviv to back off, but I think it's having a counter effect. In other words, those nations now are starting to stand up and become more protective of their sovereignty and also the citizens. They have an obligation to protect. We saw where the UK was not becoming involved, but now it appears they're sending some form of a warship to guard their naval assets on the island of Cyprus. So this may be having a reverse effect on Iran's strategy.
If there was one Middle Eastern country besides Israel that you could see joining the offensive against Iran, who would it be?
It's difficult to speculate. Saudi Arabia and Iran have been going back for decades. It seems that Iran has targeted the Saudi oil industry. So it's a potential to see if Saudi, potentially Jordan, based on their close ties. But then again, it just takes one drone, right, to hit a hotel, and 170 civilians in one nation are killed. There could be demand on the streets of that nation to take some sort of retaliation against Iran for inflicting such casualties.
Iran has an amazing stockpile of drones. Some say over 30,000. Is that what you've heard?
I don't have a number, but yes, reporting indicates that they have tunnels with drones that very cheap. As a matter of fact, the indication is that what caused the six fatalities for the United States was a drone that hit a trailer. So yes, they still have a lot of missiles that are capable of doing damage, and drones, which is becoming the new instrument of war, if you will, for future warfare. We've seen that on the Ukrainian battlefield, and I think this is going to be something that we'll be seeing in the future as well.
Mm. I mean, drones are just becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper every day. So,
It's
you
a
know,
poor man's war, right? You can fight that, and the other facet too, right? We spoke about before. I mentioned IEDs, and getting into what Iran was noted for, and Iraq was supporting explosively formed penetrators, which caused a lot of damage to U.S. personnel. Over 600 dead with that. But you can see this target civilian infrastructure too, throughout Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. So if they have any sleeper cells in this country, I'm sure that's one of the facets that Homeland Security within the United States is looking into. So what usually happens here is we harden critical infrastructure, for example, a water supply, power supply, electrical grids, transportation assets, airports. So you can expect that on the homeland as well, because anybody can take a cheap drone board on Amazon Prime and cause some form of damage, even if it's crashing it into an commercial airline while taking off or landing. So we have to be cognizant of that.
yeah, no, Libya went after Pan Am Flight 103. Do you see Iran going after a commercial airliner?
At this particular point, no. I think right now Iran has to worry about the defense in and around their territory. But then again, this is more of a Western way of war, and I discussed this in a lot of the presentations that I give. Just because this thing, and nobody knows when it's going to end or how it's going to end, but I'm just going to make an assumption. Suppose it ends in 9 months, right? And then America feels good. We've achieved our goals. That doesn't mean 3 years from now that they won't target airlines, or 7 years or 12 years. People that go through this have a long memory, and
Yep.
and some of these feuds continue. Some call it forever wars, but it's kind of why we're here, right? It's been a 47-year war. I remember back in 1979, I sat as a sophomore, junior in high school, very concerned because I was coming into draft age and where we were with the Iranian crisis in the Middle East, holding hostages for 440 days. And this has gone on and it's the reason I joined the military, the October 23rd attack on the barracks, the Marine Corps barracks. I was stationed at Cobalt Towers during Desert Storm, and Iran was involved in that in 1996. I already spoke to you about the EFPs that were used to kill Americans in Iraq. So this has been ongoing. We call this, there's a lot of different names going around: hybrid warfare, regular warfare, gray zone. But what it is, and I liken it in my presentations, I depict Mike Tyson in a fight. And the reason I do that is people that remember paying for Mike Tyson's pay-per-view fights remember going to the bathroom, coming back, and the fight was over. It was that quick. In other words, you couldn't stand toe to toe with him. So a lot of nations that don't have the ability to stand toe to toe with the United States, they'll conduct irregular warfare. They'll do things such as terrorism, nefarious acts, cyber attacks that are below the threshold of war. A lot of people use the term plausible deniability, where we kind of know it's you, but your fingerprints aren't all over it. And they've avoided confrontation. But it's been ongoing for 47 years. One of the difficulties we have in a democracy is every 4 years we change. And I'm not critical of that. I'm an American. I'm very happy with that. But sometimes administrations don't deal with the situation here and now. They kind of kick the can down the road. And this can's been kicked now for 47 years, through both Republican and
Mhm.
Democratic administrations. And so when you have an authoritarian government, so for example, the Ayatollah was in power since 1989. They reach out to, first of all, they have a long-term vision, and they realize that the problems they're encountering now, they'll have to deal with. So a lot of Americans may ask, hey, why do we have to do this, and why do we have to do this now? About the only strategy that I've seen since the end of the Cold War, where both Republicans and Democrats agreed at the end of the Cold War that American strategy was containment of communism, particularly the USSR at the time. The only thing that I've seen us agree on as a nation, okay, an educated nation, meaning those in the know, is that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. They are the world's greatest sponsor of terrorism. I've spoken to you about several acts, and there's been several more. They are a threat in the region. They've undermined stability in that region for an extended period of time. There's also something, and again, I'm not a religious scholar, known as the 12th Imam. So in Catholicism, right, we believe in the second coming of Jesus Christ, that,
Mhm.
whether it be the end of the world or at a time that God and Christ choose, he'll come down as a second coming. My reading and understanding of that is Iran believes too that a Messiah will come down, a prophet from Muhammad, and a new caliphate will start. And that will probably come at the end of the world, right? And so the fear is when you do this and understand the religion, they are not afraid to die. Putting a nuclear weapon into the hands of Iranians is risky based on their practice of the last 47 years and basically religious beliefs are. So when I hear the debates going on today, right? Well, why did he choose now? When do we wait? Because once that weapon is in the hands of Iran, it's too late to act. So a lot of people,
Mhm.
Kim Jong Un, for example, thought that if he obtained a nuclear weapon, he would be safe because he looked at what happened with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. He also looked at what happened with Saddam Hussein. The fact that they didn't have nuclear weapons opened them up to invasion. One can look at Zelensky out of the Ukraine, right? He was promised that if he gave his nukes back to Russia, that Russia wouldn't invade, he'd be safe, and obviously that hasn't come to fruition.
Yep.
So there's a lot of incentive out there to go ahead and have that capability to thwart off, if you will, aggressive nations. One of the difficulties, too, if Iran is able to achieve nuclear success, will be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. These countries all have the material capability, meaning monetary, I should say, and as we've seen, this sale can happen anywhere, right? And you don't need a nuclear arms race in the Middle East right now. Right now, it's under control. So it is another reason that the United States, the world, the Middle East in particular, do not need to see Iran have nuclear capability.
Do you think the Iranian people have it within them to revolt, or do you think the next leader of Iran is just a more moderate, someone from within the current administration?
And so that's difficult to project. The one thing that I want to tell you, audience, as they watch this, right? And this is frustrating for me, is I've watched, generals get on, and I do appreciate watching some of the great minds, General Petraeus, Lieutenant General McMaster, General McChrystal. When I start watching majors, lieutenant colonels, and even colonels get on, unless they have a really strong background in intelligence, I don't give them much attention. They've never been at that level, right? But here's the most important thing, and I want your audience to understand this. Anybody getting up to speak, including me, can give you generalities. They can, speak about what they know in that region. The most intelligent, um, the most important thing rather is intelligence. Every half hour, every 15 minutes, the scene at the area of operations changes. Whether it be the last battle damage assessment, whether it be a strike, right? Whether it be what Signets is hearing from Iranian sources within, whether there's what's called human intelligence on the ground, relaying messages out to potentially people in Israel, the United States, or other parts of the Middle East. So I don't have that intelligence, nor does anybody really getting out there speaking on CNN, Fox News, or whatever major media is out there. So it's difficult to project what could happen. What's interesting, though, in 1979, there was such a feeling of anti Western feeling, particularly towards the United States. The demographics have changed. 75% of the individuals in Iran today, out of a population of roughly 85 to 90 million, weren't born then. So I saw a briefing years ago, and on the first PowerPoint brief was a woman in a burqa, that traditional Middle Eastern garb, all black, covering every portion of the body and face with a Quran. And they said, "Is this Iran?" And the second brief was a young woman in a Western skirt and fishnet stockings dancing on a table. And the question was, or is this Iran? So there is a quest by the younger generation to become more modern, more westernized, if you will. If some of your listeners go back and start looking at Kabul, Iran, different parts of the Middle East, these burqas are something new, right? Particularly after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. But back then, the women were conservative, but you would look at them and they were traditionally dressed like women in the West. No hijab, no burqas, able to walk the streets without a male partner. So a lot of this is being contested now. So the Iranian people have stood up. Well, we have to understand it. And, there's a certain psychological phenomenon similar to what we saw in the Holocaust, where people, even though some people may ask, how come they don't fight back? Is because they psychologically been beaten mentally, right? And so here's this population where they've just seen approximately 30,000 of their fellow citizens killed by this force. And in every authoritarian nation, right? And people are very familiar with the Gestapo, right? Because that makes it. We study German history, but all these authoritarian regimes have secret police. These are individuals that may live amongst the population, but part of their duties are to detect what's going on and to enforce the standards of that government. So the question is, do the people have the desire? Because President Trump has reached out to them, Prime Minister Netanyahu has reached out to them, but they've been beaten for so long psychologically. They may be submissive. I don't know. Again, I don't have that intelligence piece. Usually, in an operation like this, you would see some form of special operational forces acting within the confines of the borders, working with an indigenous population. As a matter of fact, there's been talk about the Kurds being armed. So one has to be careful there because, in my studies of the Middle East and my time over there, about the only thing that every Middle Eastern country, particularly Turkey, agree on is they don't want the Kurds rising up. So one has to be careful of that because you can push a balloon on one side. What's the effect on the other? And so when these decisions are made, and we like to use in the military a red cell. So if Hussey's sitting out there and I'm pontificating about, hey, this can happen, that can happen, there should be somebody with an opposing view. Well, sir, did you think about this? And if you do this, what's the second and third order effect? And we need to lay that out. So the one thing that as I look at this, people ask, how long is this going to take? And I've heard comments, days, months, right? So we really have to identify before you get into any military operation, because Colin Powell used to speak about Powell Weinberg doctrine. You have to lay clearly what your objectives are. And I've heard two objectives now, strategic level objectives. One, to ensure that Iran does not possess nuclear weapons, right? And we want to stop that. And number two, regime change. So you have to look at that. I don't know how long it's going to take. I do know in my study of this for several decades now, in my reading, that the United States was the only nation that had the ability to ensure that. Israel didn't have the air capability. They didn't have the refueling capability from what I'm reading now. They may have progressed and obtained some of that technology, but they definitely didn't have the bombs. But in all my studies, well, including the current situation, it's very difficult to achieve your objectives without boots on the ground. We saw this in Kosovo, right, when President Clinton decided to stop the genocide in Kosovo with Milosevic. 78 days, right? And the people were standing out in the middle of Serbia with Target shirts and saying, bring it on. And so you have to be careful of that as well. And from my understanding, the US and other NATO nations were starting to look at ground operations to go ahead and ensure that there'd be some form of strategic end state that was acceptable to the United States and NATO. So when the president says ground troops are not off the table, he's absolutely correct. And the other thing that I warn people on, right, is, and I want to go back to the Gulf of Tonkin in August 2nd to 4th, 1964, where, the United States alleges that North Korea, or North Vietnam rather, struck U.S. naval assets in the Gulf of Tonkin. And then we struck out, right, with some same thing, strikes into North Vietnam. And the next thing, the Viet Cong responded. We sent a battalion, which is roughly 800 Marines, to guard the air base at Da Nang. 15 years later, excess of 500,000 troops that were deployed at one time to Vietnam and 58,022 deaths. The war ended. So this has the potential to escalate. Nobody knows, right? Once you start a war, and anybody that studies it will tell you it's very easy to go ahead and start a war. The exit strategy becomes more difficult. And then how do you exit, right? Did you achieve those two objectives that the president set out? One, no nukes for Iran, and two, regime change, if that's actually what he wants to do. And Alex, you brought up an interesting point. Who comes in? I don't know. Of course, we'd like to see somebody friendly to the West, somebody friendly towards the people. But sometimes, again, they all say, right, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. you could have a more repressive regime, a regime. I don't see how much more hostile they can be to the United States, Israel, and the West, but the potential is there. So this is just at the beginning, and we're going to have to sit and wait to see how this resolves.
Does Israel have the ability to put troops on the ground, or are
Any
they?
nation has the ability to put troops on the ground, right?
Mm,
But you're going up against a military with over 1 million individuals active in reserve. You also, right? Think of the United States, right? We're a military in excess of 1.2 million. But how many people are going to come out of the hills of North Carolina, the streets of the Bronx, if, for example, Russia or
no.
China invaded us? Okay. When you're fighting for your homeland, right? And there's a sense of martyrdom, particularly within the Shia religion. If you remember, they have a holiday called Ashura where they beat themselves bloody. And this goes back centuries, right? The Shia have this kind of victim mentality, and one has to study that culture. The people, and that's another issue with bombing a nation, right? Because even if people are against their administration, I'm like we're divided here in this country. But if Russia and Chinese jets started to bomb, we're like a dysfunctional family, right? Hey, nobody touches my brother, nobody touches my sister, even though we might be fighting at the dinner table.
Hmm.
People will rally around the flag. So while Israel could send boots on the ground, they're up against a million man military. They're up against secret police, and then a population that has such animosity against Israel and particularly Jews. I mean, I'm going to say it, right?
Oh,
But
well,
the other thing one has to be concerned about too is the jihad, right? So fatwas, to my understanding, have already been put out by Iranian religious leaders. So if Israel or the United States did put boots on the ground, you could see foreign fighters come from all over the Middle East, right? We've seen the American consulate in Pakistan come under attack. Right now, the
mm,
Taliban and Pakistan are dueling. But you know what? The friend of my friend, right, is my enemy, as the old saying goes,
no,
right? Or the enemy. Yeah, I think I got it right. But you could see those two nations come together to support Iran if boots were put on the ground. So you have to be careful. Nobody has a crystal ball to see how this is going to play out.
totally. Well, thank you so much, General. This has been a great conversation. I could probably ask you questions for the next 3 hours, but we'll have to cut it short. And I hope you stay safe out there and look forward to talking again soon.
Well, Alex, it's always a pleasure speaking to you, and thanks for the opportunity. Have
Oh,
a
no,
nice day.
the pleasure's all mine, General. Just really brilliant stuff.
Thank you.